"Just don't embarrass me," my husband whispered. That was how the night began. Not with music, not with applause, not even with a smile, just that sentence, sharp and practiced, delivered like it was a perfectly reasonable request. I'm telling you this plainly because I don't want you distracted by chandeliers or champagne glasses just yet. I want you to understand the problem first. The problem was my marriage. My name is Grace. I was 58 years old that night. A mother, a retired public school teacher, and the wife of a man who had mastered the art of control without ever needing to raise his hand. But don't mistake that for kindness. Words can hit harder than fists when they're sharpened by resentment. Earlier that afternoon, just hours before the gala, I had stepped out of our bedroom wearing a soft navy dress, nothing fancy, but something I had always liked. Modest neckline, long sleeves, and a gentle shimmer that caught the light in the right places. I paired it with my mother's old silk scarf, a soft, faded rose color she used to wear on Sundays. I thought it looked elegant, nostalgic even. Calvin took one look at me and exploded. "Are you serious?" he barked, tossing his tie onto the dresser. "That's what you're wearing? You look like a church usher. And what is that thing around your neck, some kind of statement against taste?" I froze. "I just thought this scarf belonged to my—" "Of course it did," he cut in, rolling his eyes. "This is exactly what you do. Every time I have something important, you find a way to sabotage it. You want people to look at you and laugh at me." "No, Calvin," I said quickly, blinking back the sting. "I didn't mean to. I thought you liked this one." He laughed, bitter and short. "You thought wrong." I stood there, hands frozen at my sides, feeling the ground tilt beneath me. "I'll change," I whispered. "I didn't know you'd mind." He reached for the scarf, ripped it off my shoulders, and in one motion walked to the kitchen trash and shoved it deep inside, right between a crumpled coffee filter and an empty yogurt cup. "I'll buy you something better," he said flatly. "Something that doesn't look like a garage sale pity prize." When he walked out to take a phone call, I stood there staring at the trash can, heart thudding like a drum. That scarf was one of the last things I had of my mother. She used to say, "Always keep something soft close to your skin on hard days." I dug it out quietly, smoothed it out, and folded it into my purse. Not to wear, just to hold. I didn't say a word. A few hours later, we walked into the Hilton riverfront in New Orleans. Marble floors, gold lighting, the kind of place where people speak in low voices because they assume they're important. "Just don't embarrass me," Calvin whispered again as we passed the valet. He was already smiling, his face lit up for the cameras and the handshakes. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because silence had always been my safest armor. He stepped ahead of me, all polished confidence and strategic charm. I followed, my heels a little too loud against the floor, my purse too heavy with the past. I tried not to think about the scarf. I tried not to think about anything. Inside, the gala buzzed with wealth and pretense. Jazz music floated like perfume. People sipped wine, made deals with their eyes, and laughed in rehearsed tones. Calvin disappeared into a cluster of colleagues like a drop of oil in a pool of champagne slick, seamless, untouchable. "Wait by the elevator," he said before vanishing. "I'll find you later." So I stood there, near the column with the abstract sculpture that may have been a humidifier, trying to look like I belonged. I watched Calvin from across the room, watched how they loved him, how he made them love him. I didn't matter here, not to them, and not to him. But then the room shifted. It wasn't the music or the lighting. It was something else, an instinct, a current. People turned, phones slipped away. A ripple moved through the gala like a wind no one wanted to admit they felt. He had arrived. Richard Lansing, the billionaire, founder of Lansing Innovations, widower, icon. His name carried weight like gold bars. He walked without urgency, without flash, and yet all eyes followed him. Calvin moved fast, slipping through the crowd to position himself directly in Richard's path, hand extended, smile polished. But Richard didn't stop. He walked right past Calvin, past the executives, past the donors, past every person who thought they were the center of the universe. He walked straight to me. My breath caught. "Grace?" he said, stopping in front of me like I'd been the only person he came to see. "Yes?" I managed, confused. He reached out and held both my hands, not politely, not ceremonially, gently, firmly, as if they were familiar. "You probably don't remember me," he said, "but in 1992, you saved my life." Behind him, somewhere in the glittering sea of privilege, I heard a glass shatter. I didn't have to look. I knew it was Calvin. Richard's eyes didn't leave mine. "You taught me that I wasn't disposable," he said. "You stayed after school. You showed up. I never forgot." My throat tightened. "I'm hosting a summit next month, education reform. We need voices like yours. If you're willing." I nodded, too stunned to speak. Richard smiled once, nodded again, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like mist. I stood still, hands trembling, heart pounding, the memory of my mother's scarf pressed against my ribs from inside my purse. And from across the room, Calvin glared at me like I'd just ruined everything. But he was wrong. For the first time, something had been restored. Not in the room, in me. If this story touched you, hit like and comment where you're watching from. You might not be the only one in your city who needed to hear this today. The silence after Richard Lansing walked away was louder than any applause could have been. I stayed rooted in place, pulse hammering, my hands still tingling from the way he'd held them, as if they belonged to someone who mattered. Around me, the gala seemed to resume in fractured pieces, laughter that didn't quite ring true, glasses clinking too hard, a violin note gone slightly off-key. I didn't look toward Calvin right away. I wasn't ready for what I'd see, but I could feel his anger from across the room like heat coming off a stove. For once, I wasn't sure if I was afraid or just tired of being afraid. Eventually, I turned. He stood frozen in the center of the crowd, the broken stem of a champagne flute still in one hand, a forced smile plastered on his face while he murmured something to a board member. But his eyes, those eyes were locked on me, sharp and narrow. For a moment, I thought he might march across the room and cause a scene. But Calvin never made noise, unless it served him. He simply adjusted his jacket, whispered something to a nearby guest, and disappeared behind a curtain of donors. I exhaled, shaky and unsure. I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't belong to any conversation in this room. I didn't have a title or a LinkedIn page filled with buzzwords. I was just Grace, wife of Calvin R. Holt, former high school teacher, someone who once taught a troubled boy to read without looking ashamed. And somehow, that mattered more tonight than anything Calvin had prepared. A waiter passed by and offered me a fresh glass of champagne. I took it with a nod, my hand still trembling. I sipped, mostly for something to do. Across the ballroom, the jazz trio started again, a little louder this time, like they were trying to reclaim the atmosphere. People adjusted, they always do. I walked toward a quiet alcove near the tall windows overlooking the Mississippi River. The water outside glittered in the moonlight, black and silver, slow and strong. It reminded me of something my mother once said, sitting on the porch during a summer storm. "Still water doesn't mean it's shallow, baby. Still just means steady." I pressed a hand against the silk scarf in my purse, feeling its folds like the memory of her voice. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Calvin stayed on the other side of the room. I stayed by the windows. Occasionally, I caught people glancing my way. Not in pity, something else. Curiosity, maybe. Respect, though that word felt too big. I wasn't sure how to carry it. Eventually, Calvin found his way back to me. His smile was back in place, but it had edges now. "Ready to go?" he asked, his tone brittle. I nodded, said nothing. We walked out in silence, down the marble hallway and into the warm, muggy night. The valet brought the car quickly, too quickly, as if sensing tension. Calvin didn't open the door for me. He never did. I slid into the passenger seat and stared straight ahead. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. I could feel his hand twitching on the wheel. When we stopped at a red light near the French Quarter, he finally spoke. "What the hell was that?" I kept my eyes on the windshield. "What was what?" "Don't play dumb, Grace." "Lansing. That whole performance." "There was no performance," I said calmly. He remembered me. "And you just stood there like you planned the whole thing." "I didn't," I said, quieter now. "I was as surprised as you." He laughed, sharp and mean. "Oh, I doubt that. You've always had a flair for timing." That stung more than I wanted to admit. "He was my student, from years ago. I helped him, once. And now he's a billionaire and you think that makes you special?" I turned to face him. No. I think being remembered for something good makes me human. End quote. It using tonight too that. His jaw tightened. You embarrassed me. There it was again. The word embarrassed. The same word he'd used when I mispronounced a name at a donor brunch, or when I cried during a funeral service because I forgot to bring tissues. He held it like a knife, dull from overuse but still sharp at the edge. I didn't do anything but exist, I said. That's not an offense. You don't get it, he snapped. People saw you. They're going to ask questions. They're going to wonder what makes you so important. For the first time, I didn't flinch. Let them. We rode the rest of the way in silence. When we arrived at the hotel, he got out without waiting for me, walked ahead without a glance back. I followed, because habit is powerful. Back in the room, he went to the bathroom and slammed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, dress still clinging to my skin. I reached into my purse and pulled out the scarf, unfolded it slowly, pressed it to my cheek. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurting, but because I felt something stronger underneath the ache. I felt awake. For years, I'd shrunk myself to fit the shape of Calvin's world. I had whispered when I wanted to speak. I had apologized when I hadn't done anything wrong. But tonight, for the first time in decades, someone had looked at me and seen more than just a wife. More than a placeholder. He'd seen Grace. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to see her too. Calvin didn't speak to me the next morning. Not a word. He moved around the hotel room like I was invisible, just a piece of furniture he had grown tired of. He ironed his shirt in silence, adjusted his watch, checked his phone. The only sound was the soft hum of traffic along Canal Street and the occasional muffled voice from the hallway. I sat by the window, coffee untouched, watching the sunlight smear across the river below like melted gold. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was tired. Deep tired. The kind that didn't come from lack of sleep but from carrying too many years of someone else's weight. Calvin had been like this before, quiet, tight, punishing. But something was different this time. Something in me was different. I hadn't told him about the summit invitation. I didn't plan to. Not yet. I wanted that moment to be mine for a little while longer, untouched, untainted. It had been years since anyone had looked at me with expectation instead of dismissal. I needed to hold on to that look. Memorize it. At checkout, Calvin barely made eye contact with the desk clerk. He muttered his name, handed over the room keys, and walked out. I followed, scarf tucked safely in my purse. He didn't ask if I wanted breakfast. He didn't ask if I needed to use the restroom. He just headed for the car like this was a business trip gone wrong and I was the unpaid assistant. The drive back to Baton Rouge was just under 2 hours, but it felt longer. Neither of us spoke. The radio stayed off. The silence stretched, thick, and coiled. I stared out the window at the blur of highway signs and cypress trees, trying not to count how many times I'd made this drive in silence before. When we finally pulled into our driveway, I opened the door before the engine stopped. I didn't wait for him. I didn't glance back. I walked inside, kicked off my shoes, and went straight to the bedroom. He stayed downstairs, probably to make calls or pour himself a stiff drink, or both. That was his way of dealing distraction and control. Mine used to be retreat. I'd crawl back into myself, swallow the anger, and let time wear it down to numbness. But not this time. This time, I opened the closet. Our bedroom closet was large, walk-in, custom shelves. It smelled faintly of cedar and Calvin's cologne. His suits lined one side in perfect color order, navy to charcoal to black. My side was smaller, less deliberate. A few modest dresses, cardigans, some shoes I hadn't worn in years, and one old plastic storage bin on the top shelf marked Financials. I pulled it down and opened the lid. Inside were folders, neat, labeled taxes, mortgage, investments, retirement. I dug through each, careful not to bend or tear anything. For years, Calvin had insisted on handling the real stuff. He'd say, "It's easier this way, Grace," or "You hate numbers," or "Let me take care of it." And I'd believed him, or rather, I'd let myself believe that trusting him was the same as being secure. I opened the retirement folder. Empty. Not a single page. No statements, no account numbers. just a single sheet with our names typed at the top and my signature at the bottom. I stared at it, heart slowing. I didn't remember signing this. It looked like my handwriting. It probably was. But I didn't remember what it was for. There were no dates, no explanations, just a vague authorization form that gave Calvin primary authority for financial oversight. I sat back on the floor, folder in my lap, and breathed slowly. Had I signed away my access? Had he asked me to do this during dinner, while the news played in the background and I was distracted by dishes and bills and something burning in the oven? Had I nodded and signed, trusting him like I always had? The thought made me nauseous. I closed the folder, put it back in the bin, and returned everything to the shelf. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I needed more than a missing document and a faded memory. I needed answers. That afternoon, I made an excuse about needing groceries and left the house alone. I drove past the market, past the pharmacy, and kept going until I reached the credit union. It was quiet inside. A single teller, 2 people in line, the faint scent of hand sanitizer and printer ink. I waited my turn, rehearsing my question in my head. When I reached the counter, a woman about my age smiled politely. She wore thin-rimmed glasses and a wedding ring that matched mine almost exactly. "Hi there," she said. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to check on a retirement account," I said. "Joint account, in my name and my husband's." She nodded and typed. "Name? Grace Holt. My husband is Calvin Holt." Her fingers paused. Her brow creased slightly. She typed again. "Is there an issue?" I asked. "Your account is active," she said slowly, "but the mailing address was changed 6 months ago. It's now listed under a P.O. box in Baton Rouge." My stomach dropped. "Apuo. Box?" I repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "Who authorized that?" She looked at the screen, hesitated, then said, "Calvin Holt. He has power of attorney on file." My throat closed. "I never signed that." "I'm sorry, ma'am, but it's here on record. We have scanned documentation with your signature." I stood there, lightheaded, my mind a blur of heat and static. "Would you like a printed copy of the authorization?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said. "Please." She handed it to me in an envelope. I walked out to my car, locked the doors, and just sat there with the engine off. My hands shook as I opened the envelope and pulled out the copy. It was my signature, but I didn't remember signing it. And in that moment, something shifted again. Not like a crack, like a door swinging open. This wasn't about a scarf, or a dress, or a billionaire remembering my name. This was about control. And I was about to start remembering everything he hoped I'd forget. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in the grocery store parking lot with the car idling, the windows halfway down, and the envelope in my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, heart thudding slowly like it was waiting for permission to panic. It wasn't just the signature. It was the pattern, the quiet nudges, the soft, let me handle it reassurances, the missing paperwork that always came with an excuse. Calvin had never yelled when it came to the finances. He didn't need to. He kept everything clean, quiet, legal. That was the part that hurt the most. He'd planned this. I drove home before sunset. The street was quiet, our neighbors' driveways lined with familiar cars, porch lights just starting to blink on. The kind of neighborhood where lawns stay trimmed and Christmas lights come down by mid-January. The kind of place where trouble hides behind thick blinds and polite smiles. Calvin was in his home office, door cracked, voice low. I heard him say my name, Grace, followed by a short laugh. Then, "She doesn't understand how this stuff works. I've got it covered." I stopped mid-step in the hallway. "She's still wrapped up in that teacher mindset," he said. "Emotion over logic. She'd probably forget her own bank account if I didn't manage it." Another chuckle. I couldn't tell who was on the other end. One of his colleagues, our financial planner. I backed away slowly, careful not to make the floor creak. My hands were clenched before I realized it. I went into the guest room and locked the door, not because I was afraid of him, but because I needed a space that was mine, even if it was temporary. I opened the envelope again, pulled out the copy of the power of attorney form, and studied every line. It looked legitimate. My name was printed clearly, my signature smooth and familiar. But I had no memory of signing it. I racked my brain. When could this have happened? He'd probably handed it to me during dinner, slid it in with other documents like insurance updates or tax forms. I'd probably been distracted, maybe tired from grading papers, maybe still wearing my work shoes. I signed it because I trusted him. That thought hit like a punch. I signed it because I trusted him. And he used that trust to make me disappear from our own life. That night, I made dinner. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed the rhythm. Stirring sauce, boiling pasta, chopping herbs. My hands remembered how to move, even if the rest of me felt frozen. I didn't say anything about the credit union. I didn't say anything at all. Calvin came downstairs like nothing had happened. He poured himself a glass of wine, scrolled through his phone while I plated the food. We ate in silence. The only sound was the clink of forks against ceramic. When he finished, he pushed his plate away, wiped his mouth and said, "You've been quiet today." I looked at him. Really looked. The man across from me was the same man I'd once loved so deeply I couldn't imagine a life without him. The same man who had kissed my forehead before interviews, who had fallen asleep with his head in my lap after long workdays. But now, he was also the man who had quietly rewritten the rules of our marriage to suit his ambition. "Just tired," I said. He nodded. "Big night yesterday. You handled yourself well." That was his version of a compliment. I didn't respond. "You know," he continued, "we should probably start prepping for that conference in Dallas next month. I might have you stay back for that one. Optics, you know. Too many new clients." I stood up, picked up his plate, and walked to the sink. "You don't have to decide that now," I said over my shoulder. He didn't reply. He never did when he thought the conversation was over. Later that night, after he went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and started writing. Not a journal, not a letter, a list. Every time I had been asked to sign something without context, every bank statement I hadn't seen, every time he'd told me I didn't need to worry about something that directly affected me. I filled 2 pages before I stopped. I stared at the last line. He changed the mailing address 6 months ago. I needed help. I couldn't navigate this alone. And then I remembered the card. Richard Lansing's card, tucked into the back pocket of my purse. I retrieved it like it was something fragile, ran my thumb over the raised print. There was no title beneath his name, no company name, just a phone number and a quiet kind of confidence. It was nearly midnight, but I called anyway. A woman answered. "Yes?" "Hi," I said. "My name is Grace Holt. Richard gave me this number." A pause. Then, "Of course. One moment." End quote. "This is problem 77. Soft piano music filled the line. Then a man's voice came on. "This is Paul Jennings," he said. "Richard told me you might call." "He did?" "He said you might need some clarity. I'm a forensic accountant." The words didn't quite register. "I think my husband's been hiding things from me," I said. "Financially." "You're not alone," Paul said gently. "And you're not powerless." He offered to meet me in person. Quiet place. No pressure. Just a conversation. I agreed. After we hung up, I stared at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. For the first time, I didn't see someone lost. I saw someone waking up. The diner sat at the edge of town, tucked between a used bookstore and a dry cleaner that hadn't updated its signage since the early 90s. Its neon sign flickered, "Open 24 hours," even though everyone in Baton Rouge knew it closed at 10 p.m. The booths were vinyl, the coffee was strong, and the waitresses called everyone Hun. It was the kind of place where secrets felt safer somehow, hidden between bites of pie and refills of burnt coffee. I chose a table near the window, facing the parking lot. I didn't want to be surprised. Paul Jennings arrived right on time. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Gray at the temples, button-down shirt tucked into well-worn jeans, and a leather briefcase that had seen some life. He introduced himself with a nod and a quiet handshake. No showmanship, no rush. He asked if I'd like coffee before we began. I said yes, even though I barely drank any of it. He opened the briefcase, pulled out a legal pad, and a pen that clicked softly in his hand. "You said your husband has power of attorney," Paul began, writing the date at the top of the page. "Yes, but I don't remember signing it," I replied. He nodded. "That's common. Often it's buried inside other documents, sometimes disguised as routine paperwork, health forms, tax revisions, even retirement updates. That's what I think happened," I said. "He gave me a stack of papers a few months ago, said they were just for the insurance." Paul raised his brows slightly. You still have those? I don't know, I said. Maybe. He reorganized our files last month, said it was to declutter. He didn't comment, just kept writing. I went to the credit union, I added. Found out he changed our mailing address. I never saw it happen. He did it 6 months ago. I know, say. Did they say why he was allowed to make that change? They said it was within his rights because of the power of attorney. Paul nodded again, calm and measured. Did they show you a scanned copy? I handed over the envelope from my purse. He pulled out the form, unfolded it on the table, and studied it. He tapped a finger against the signature line. Looks clean, he said, but the style of the document doesn't match the year it was supposedly signed. See this logo here? He pointed to the corner. That branding wasn't used by the bank until last spring. I blinked. So, if you really signed this a few years ago like he claims, it would have had the old logo. My stomach tightened. You mean it's fake? I mean it's suspicious, and that's where we start. He slid the paper back into the envelope carefully. Then he leaned back, voice low and steady. I want you to understand something, Grace. What's happening here isn't rare, especially in long-term marriages where one partner controls the finances. It starts with small things, taking over the taxes, managing the accounts. But over time, that control becomes weaponized. The other person becomes a dependent, on paper. And in reality, I looked down at my coffee. That's what I feel like, a dependent. You're not, he said firmly. You're a person with rights, and you're not crazy. You're not forgetful. You've been pushed out of your own life, and I can help you push back. He handed me a checklist, steps to take, accounts to access, questions to ask without raising alarms. This isn't about drama, Paul said. It's about daylight, bringing what's been hidden into view. I felt my throat tighten, not with fear but something else. Recognition. For the first time, someone was speaking to me like I was capable, like I mattered. I don't want to ruin his life, I said quietly. Paul looked me straight in the eye. Then you're already better than him. We sat in silence for a moment as the waitress refilled our cups. The bell above the diner door jingled. A young couple walked in laughing, still holding hands from the parking lot. I envied their ease. When I got home later that evening, the house was dark except for the TV in the living room, playing some documentary Calvin always fell asleep to. I slipped in quietly, went to the guest room, and locked the door. I pulled out the checklist and began my work. I started with email. Most of our financial accounts were in Calvin's name, but years ago, when we refinanced the house, we'd created a shared email to receive statements. I hadn't accessed it in forever. The password had been changed. But I remembered something. The password reset questions had been created by me. I answered them. My childhood street, my first car, the name of my first pet. It worked. The inbox was full statements, confirmations, notices of changes, most of them marked as read, none by me. One email stood out. Subject, confirmation of beneficiary update, Fidelity retirement account. My name wasn't on it. My hands trembled as I clicked through the details. The primary beneficiary had been changed to a trust I didn't recognize. The secondary was left blank. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I printed the email, folded it carefully, and placed it inside a file labeled Truth. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was scared, but because the version of me I had silenced for years was finally wide awake, and she was not going back to sleep. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My mind wasn't fogged by confusion or doubt. It was sharp, focused, like something had snapped back into place overnight. I got dressed without rushing, fixed my hair, and put on a light shade of lipstick I hadn't worn in months. Not for Calvin, for myself. He was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, dressed in a gray suit and scrolling through his phone at the counter, half a banana in his hand. "Morning," I said calmly. He looked up, startled, then gave me a quick nod. "Morning." He rarely commented on my appearance anymore, and today was no exception. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and opened the local paper. I didn't offer him breakfast. I didn't ask about his day. He finished the banana, grabbed his briefcase, and turned to leave. "I'll be back late," he said. "Board dinner." "All right." He paused. I could feel it without looking up, a flicker of suspicion. But I didn't give him anything, just another sip of coffee and the sound of a turning page. When he left, I waited 10 minutes before moving. I pulled the printout from the Fidelity email and placed it inside the folder labeled Truth. I added a sticky note, changed beneficiary without consent. Then I pulled out my phone and called Paul. "I need to know about the trust Calvin created," I said, "the one listed as the new beneficiary." "I figured you'd ask," he replied. "Already started looking into it. It's called CRH Family Trust. Formed last year. Guess who the sole trustee is? Calvin. Bingo. There's a secondary listed too. Someone named Amber R. Holt." I blinked. "Amber? I don't know an Amber Holt. Relative? No, not unless he's hiding another family." There was silence on the line. "Would you like me to dig into her?" "Yes," I said, voice tight. "Please." We ended the call, and I sat in the quiet, staring at the name. Amber R. Holt. The name felt like a pebble in my shoe, small, but unbearable once you noticed it. I tried not to spiral. I busied myself around the house, did laundry, took a walk, watered the plants Calvin always said were a waste of money, but the name clung to me. Amber R. Holt. That night, Calvin came home later than usual. He smelled faintly of scotch, and something floral, not my perfume. Not mine. He smiled when he saw me in the kitchen. "Still up?" he asked. "Just cleaning up," I replied, motioning to the spotless counters. He poured himself a drink and leaned on the counter, watching me. "You seem different," he said. "Do I?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Something in your eyes." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Maybe I'm just seeing clearer." He didn't like that. I saw the twitch at the corner of his jaw, but he said nothing. He went upstairs. I waited until I heard the water running for his shower before sneaking into his office. I knew the layout like the back of my hand. I used to help him with invoices and receipts when his business was young, back when he still asked me to be part of things. I opened the locked file drawer using the spare key I'd hidden years ago in the hollow leg of the desk. I moved past the obvious files, contracts, taxes, board minutes, until I found a manila folder labeled CRH Trust. Inside were bank statements, transfers, legal documents, and 2 photos. One of Calvin, smiling beside a younger woman, blonde, mid-30s, her hand on his chest like she'd done it 100 times. The second was of the same woman holding a baby, Amber R. Holt. I sank into his leather chair, the document slipping onto my lap. The dates matched. The trust was created 2 months after that photo, monthly payments, a property deed, all under the trust name. He had another life, a second life, and he was protecting it more than he was protecting me. I took photos of everything with my phone, every page, every transaction. I returned the folder, locked the drawer, and left his office exactly as I found it. Back in the guest room, I curled into bed, clutching my phone, heart pounding. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But inside me, something shifted from pain to resolve. He wasn't just trying to erase me from his finances. He was trying to replace me, and I was done letting him succeed. I didn't sleep that night. Not a single minute. I lay in the guest room, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer me answers. The photos on my phone were burned into my mind. The younger woman, the baby, the hand on Calvin's chest, her hand, the way mine used to rest there when I believed I was safe. Amber R. Holt. The name alone felt like an insult, as if she had taken my place not just in his heart, but in the legal fabric of his world. The trust, the house deed, the new beneficiary, all of it carefully arranged while he told me not to worry about the details. I checked the time, 4:52 a.m. I got up and dressed quietly. Jeans, t-shirt, comfortable shoes. I didn't even bother with makeup. I wasn't going to be someone else today. I was going to be Grace. I left Calvin asleep upstairs, snoring like a man without secrets. Paul met me at the same diner, his coffee already half gone. He looked up as I slid into the booth, and before I could say a word, he held up his phone. I found her. He turned the screen toward me. A LinkedIn page, Amber Renee Holt, marketing consultant, freelance, Baton Rouge-based, a smiling headshot, polished but soft, not flashy, not wild. She looked normal, safe. She's listed as unmarried, No visible connections to Calvin publicly. But I traced a joint property ownership through the trust, same one listed as the beneficiary of your husband's retirement accounts. He flipped to the next page. A photo of a modest brick home in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from ours. She owns this place. Or technically the trust does, but it's her address. I stared at the house. The lawn was neatly trimmed. A tricycle was parked near the porch steps. "And the child?" I asked, voice hoarse. 2 years old. Name's Caleb. Birth certificate lists Calvin Richard Holt as the father. My mouth went dry. Caleb, Calvin, the initials CRH, the trust's name. He didn't just start a new life. He named it after himself. "I can't believe this," I whispered. Paul leaned forward, voice low. "Grace, this isn't an affair. This is a second family, a hidden legacy. And he's setting things up so you're erased when he's gone." I nodded slowly, the truth settling like a heavy coat over my shoulders. "I want to protect myself," I said. "I want to understand what I'm entitled to. Legally, financially, emotionally. I've got nothing left. But I won't walk away with nothing. Not after 31 years. Paul pulled out a folder and laid it on the table. "I've started drafting a plan. We'll secure copies of everything, set up a forensic audit of shared accounts, and this is important, we need to act before he moves anything else." I listened, took notes, nodded when I needed to, but my mind kept drifting back to Caleb, the child, the boy who would grow up not knowing how many people had to be broken to make room for him. "He doesn't know about me," I said quietly. "Who?" "The boy. Caleb. He doesn't know I exist. To him, I'll just be a ghost woman who shows up in his father's obituary one day." Paul didn't answer. There was nothing to say. When I got home, Calvin was still gone. I assumed he'd gone straight from his board dinner to Amber's house. It wasn't the first time I'd suspected, but now the evidence was irrefutable. I sat in the kitchen and opened my laptop. I typed a name into the search bar. Sandra Whitmore, my attorney friend from college. We hadn't spoken in years, but I remembered the way she hugged me at our reunion and said, "If you ever need anything, you call me. I mean it." I needed something now. I drafted the email carefully. Factual, calm, like a teacher explaining a problem to the school board. I attached the photos, the trust documents, a copy of the beneficiary change. Then I clicked send. It felt like exhaling after years of holding my breath. That afternoon, Calvin came home. I didn't greet him at the door. I didn't ask how his day was. I watched him move through the house like a man completely unaware that his life had already begun to crack. "Everything all right?" he asked as he loosened his tie. "Everything's fine," I replied. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was waiting for something, but I had nothing more to give. That night, I moved back into our bedroom. I didn't explain. I didn't ask permission. I just took my place. Because I had built this life, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, and I wasn't going to leave quietly. Sleeping in the master bedroom again felt strange. The mattress was too firm, Calvin's preference. The pillows smelled faintly of his cologne. But the walls, the furniture, the creak in the floor by the window, those were mine. I had chosen the paint color. I had refinished the nightstands. I had lived in this room for over 3 decades, even if I'd spent the last few years exiled to the guest room like some forgotten house guest. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan, waiting to see if Calvin would say something. He didn't. He climbed into bed, turned to his side with a sigh, and disappeared into the dark without a word. By morning, he was gone before I woke up. I took it as a small gift. Sandra Whitmore replied to my email around 10 a.m. Her message was brief but powerful. "Let's talk. Call me at noon. Bring everything." I spent the next 2 hours printing out documents, organizing the photos, and double-checking the timeline I had pieced together. I included a copy of our marriage license, tax returns, and all the joint property records I could find. Years of shared life reduced to sheets of paper and receipts. Proof that I had been there, even if Calvin had done his best to erase me. At noon sharp, I called. Sandra's voice came through warm and sharp, just like I remembered. She asked pointed questions, listened carefully, and didn't once interrupt while I told her the whole story. From the scarf in the trash, to the trust documents, to the little boy named Caleb. When I finished, there was a long pause. Grace, she said gently, you've got more leverage than you think. And down freight. End quote. I do. 31 years of marriage. Most of his assets were built during your marriage, yes? Yes. I supported him when he had nothing. I worked full-time. I helped launch his first business. Good. Louisiana's a community property state. That means you're entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage, no matter whose name is on it. I swallowed. Even the trust? She paused. That's trickier. If he used joint assets to fund it, and I suspect he did, then yes, you may have a claim. My hands trembled slightly. And what about Amber? I'll need to look into her legal standing. But let me be clear. What he's done, hiding assets, forging documents, diverting funds, those are serious issues. And if he's committed fraud, that opens the door for a very different kind of legal proceeding. I exhaled. I'm not trying to destroy him. I just want what's mine. Sandra's voice softened. Grace, after everything he's taken from you, simply reclaiming what's yours is not destruction. It's survival. We agreed to meet in person that Friday. She wanted to see the original documents and talk about next steps. As I ended the call, something settled in me. Not peace, exactly, but a sense of direction. I had a plan. That afternoon, I went to the library, not because I needed books, but because I needed space. Quiet, time to think. I sat near the large windows in the back, watched the trees sway outside, and started writing again. Not just lists this time. Thoughts, memories. The first time Calvin held my hand. The time we danced in the kitchen after paying off our first mortgage. The little moments that once felt permanent and sacred. They weren't sacred anymore. They were camouflage. Calvin came home around 6. He was in a good mood, too good, laughing at some video on his phone, humming as he loosened his tie. Long day? I asked, pretending. Productive, he said, grabbing a soda from the fridge. You? Very. He didn't ask for details. He never did. At dinner, I brought up something small, something strategic. I was thinking we should update our will, I said lightly. Just to be responsible. He glanced up. Why? Just seems like the smart thing to do. We're not getting younger, and I think we owe it to each other. He nodded, distracted. Sure, I'll call Gerald. No, I said. I already asked around. I'll handle it this time. He looked at me, surprised. You? I smiled. Yes, I'd like to be more involved. His surprise flickered into suspicion. What brought this on? Just trying to be a partner, I said sweetly. Isn't that what marriage is? He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. The silence between us felt like a game now, one where I finally understood the rules. That night, after he went to bed, I emailed Paul and Sandra a summary of the dinner conversation. We were going to use it, leverage it. If Calvin gave me control of the new will, I could ask questions, review documents, track inconsistencies. I wasn't hunting for revenge. I was building a case, piece by piece. And Calvin had no idea that the woman he thought was shrinking away was quietly taking back the space she'd been denied. 2 days later, Calvin handed me a folder. I spoke with Gerald, he said over his coffee. He said we can start drafting a revised will this week. Just need to fill out a few basic details. I took the folder calmly, as if it were a grocery list instead of a document that could seal my fate. He didn't ask if I wanted help. He assumed I'd just sign and smile like always. Instead, I opened the folder at the kitchen table after he left for work. The first page was a standard form. The second listed primary assets and beneficiaries. That's where the twist came in. He'd left the line for spouse blank. He'd filled in CRH Family Trust for the majority of our investments, with Amber listed as successor trustee. No mention of Caleb. No mention of me. I stared at the paper for a long time. He wasn't even hiding it anymore. I called Sandra immediately. You need to make a copy of that document, she said without hesitation. We're getting very close to formal discovery, but that proves his intent. Intent to do what? To disinherit you, illegally, and possibly fraudulently, depending on when that trust was established and with what funds. If we can tie it to joint income, he's got a serious problem. A pause. Then her voice softened. Are you okay? I swallowed. I'm holding. We're going to get through this, she said. That afternoon, I did something I never imagined myself doing. I drove to Amber's house. It wasn't a plan, not exactly, but something inside me needed to see her. Not to scream, not to fight. I just needed to look her in the eye and understand how someone could step into another woman's life without hesitation. Her house was modest, white shutters, garden gnome by the mailbox, a red tricycle on the porch. I parked across the street and waited. 10 minutes passed. Then the door opened. She stepped out, holding Caleb on her hip. He looked about 2, just like Paul said. Chubby cheeks, big brown eyes, a tiny baseball cap perched sideways on his head. Amber looked. Tired. Not glamorous, not malicious, just like any young mother. She didn't see me. She kissed Caleb's cheek and strapped him into a car seat in the back of a navy blue SUV. Then she got in and drove off. I sat there, frozen. There was a child. A real, living child. And Calvin had built an entire life around him, a life he planned to protect at my expense. I drove home in silence, heart pounding, hands gripping the wheel. When I got back, I pulled out a fresh legal pad and started a new list. 1. Visit with Sandra. Finalize timeline. 2. Confront Calvin? If so, when and how? 3. Research spousal rights in community property states. 4. Prepare safe exit plan. 5. Lock down personal documents. Passport, birth certificate, marriage license. 6. Secure personal funds. 7. Record any conversations going forward. I wasn't planning to leave him yet. Not because I wanted to stay, but because I wanted to leave with power, not fear. That evening, Calvin was in a good mood again. He poured 2 glasses of wine and asked if I wanted to watch something on Netflix. I said yes. I sat beside him on the couch, sipping wine, pretending to watch a documentary about French vineyards while my brain rewrote the next chapter of my life. At one point, he leaned over and touched my arm. "I've been thinking," he said, "maybe we should take a trip. Just the 2 of us. Reset a bit." I turned to him, heart pounding, and smiled. That sounds lovely. I knew exactly what he was doing. He felt it, the shift, the distance. He was trying to buy time. But the calendar in my mind was already marked. Not with dates. With endings. And beginnings. We didn't take the trip. Calvin brought it up a few more times, each mention more forced than the last. "Maybe Florida," he'd say. "Or the mountains." I'd nod and smile and ask vague questions. Should we drive or fly? Knowing full well I had no intention of going anywhere with him. Not anymore. The idea of vacationing with the man who was quietly dismantling my life was laughable, except nothing about this felt funny. Not when I saw him smiling at texts that arrived late at night. Not when I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a gold bracelet sized for a much smaller wrist than mine. Not when I discovered, tucked into the glove compartment of his car, a tiny envelope addressed to A.R.H. in his handwriting. Amber Renee Holt. He didn't even try to disguise it. I began documenting everything. Not just the financials, those were already being handled by Sandra and Paul, but the subtle things, the phone calls he took in the garage, the way his calendar suddenly included client lunches that didn't match any of his public appointments, the twice-weekly dry cleaning runs even though he hadn't worn anything new, the increased number of late meetings. I didn't confront him. I waited. And while I waited, I prepared. Paul helped me open a personal bank account in my name only. We transferred a portion of our joint savings into it under the category of household reserves, which was perfectly legal in our state. Sandra reviewed every step. I collected my personal documents, birth certificate, marriage license, social security card, and locked them in a small fireproof box I hid in the garage behind the tool cabinet. I also reached out to an appraiser to discreetly assess the value of several shared assets, including the antique desk Calvin inherited from his father and the artwork in his office. I made a spreadsheet. I filed copies. This wasn't about pettiness. It was about proof. He'd spent years building his life on the assumption that I would never challenge him, that I'd stay small, silent. But silent women don't get remembered in trusts. One Tuesday afternoon, while Calvin was out, I received an unexpected call. "Grace Holt?" the voice asked. "Yes, this is Gina. I work at Dr. Heller's pediatric office. I just wanted to confirm Caleb Holt's insurance information. We have your name listed on the emergency contact form." I nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry," I said carefully. "Can you repeat that?" She did, slowly. And there it was, my full name, Grace Holt, listed as the emergency contact for a 2-year-old child who was not mine. "Is this not correct?" she asked, confusion creeping into her voice. "I think there's been a mix-up," I said, heart pounding. "I'm not his mother, or guardian." "Oh, I'm so sorry. We'll update the record." I hung up, my hand trembling. This was Calvin's arrogance. Again, careless, or maybe deliberate. A paper trail that looped back to me, linking me legally, perhaps even financially, to a child I hadn't known existed until 2 weeks ago. I called Sandra immediately. "This is big," she said. "If he's using your identity or linking your name to the care of this child without consent, it complicates everything. There are insurance implications, legal liabilities. And if he's claiming you two are still unified while simultaneously supporting a second family, then I can prove double living," I finished. "Fraud." "Exactly." That night, Calvin came home later than usual. He smelled faintly of baby powder. I stood at the kitchen island, reading the paper, calm on the outside. "How was your day?" I asked. He kissed my cheek. "Long. Meetings. You?" "Strangely informative." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Someone from a pediatrician's office called me today, asked if I was Caleb Holt's emergency contact." He froze. "Just for a second. But I saw it." "That's odd," he said too quickly. "Must be a clerical error." I smiled, slow and cold. "Sure, that must be it." He turned away, muttering something about needing a shower. I let him go. But something had shifted again. I wasn't just collecting evidence now. I was building a case strong enough to knock down everything he'd built behind my back. And he was beginning to realize it. The cracks in Calvin's facade began to show almost immediately after the phone call from the pediatrician's office. Subtle at first, longer silences, sudden mood swings, and that telltale darting of the eyes when I asked simple questions. He was beginning to realize I knew, but he didn't know how much, and I had no intention of telling him. Not yet. That week, Sandra scheduled our first official legal meeting. We met at her office in downtown Baton Rouge, in a quiet building near the courthouse. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a shift. The air smelled of old paper and coffee, and the walls were lined with shelves of thick legal binders. It was serious, real. My fight had entered a new phase. Sandra greeted me with a hug, firm and warm. "You're doing beautifully," she said. "Most women don't make it this far before they fold. I have an everybody savin' marrying." "I'm not folding," I replied. "Not ever again." She smiled. "Good, because it's time we show Calvin what he's really up against." She walked me through the next steps: formal discovery, subpoenaing the trust documents, financial audits. Paul had already traced several hidden accounts linked to shell companies, one of which had been funneling money to Amber's mortgage. "All of it built with joint marital assets," Sandra explained, "which means you're entitled to half, maybe more, depending on how we prove the deception." I left that meeting with a new folder, this one labeled Litigation Prep. It felt like armor. At home, I began scanning everything into a private cloud account. I didn't trust physical copies anymore. I also started recording my conversations with Calvin. Legally, Louisiana is a one-party consent state, which meant I didn't have to tell him. It felt strange at first, placing my phone on the counter each time we talked, but over time it became second nature. And the things he said? He handed me everything I needed. "You always blow things out of proportion," he snapped one night when I asked why he changed our mailing address. "I'm just trying to protect our assets from bad decisions," he muttered when I questioned a large withdrawal from our joint account. "You don't understand business, Grace. That's why I keep you out of it." Each sentence, a gift. Meanwhile, the man himself was unraveling. He started coming home early, then late again, then not at all. He became irritable at dinner, suspicious of my calm demeanor. He asked more questions, but I answered fewer. He stared at my phone when it buzzed, asking casually, "Who's that?" with a smile that never reached his eyes. He was afraid. He just didn't know how to name it. One evening, I caught him rummaging through my nightstand drawer when he thought I was outside watering the plants. He jumped when I stepped into the room. "Looking for something?" I asked, voice level. He cleared his throat, holding up a pair of reading glasses. Mine fell behind the dresser. "They're on your desk," I said. next to the bills I haven't been allowed to read in 3 years. His face twitched. "Don't start, Grace." I didn't. I simply turned and walked out. He didn't follow. The next morning, I took a small but meaningful step. I reactivated my old teaching license. It had lapsed after I retired early to support Calvin's business full-time. But now, I wanted it back. Not because I needed the income, because I needed the identity, the independence. It was the first thing I had done in years that had nothing to do with him, and it felt like breathing again. At dinner that night, Calvin brought it up. "I got an email today," he said, cutting into his steak, "from the licensing board." "Oh?" "Said you updated your professional status." I smiled. "That's right." He paused, fork midway to his mouth. "Why?" "Because I can." His jaw worked silently. Then he chuckled a thin, strained sound. "You really think a teaching certificate is going to protect you?" "I don't need protection," I said. "I need freedom." He didn't reply. He didn't finish his meal. Instead, he stood, walked to the sink, and stared out the window for a long time. I knew that look. It was the same one he used to give before closing a deal, calculating, quiet, dangerous. But what he didn't know? I wasn't a transaction anymore. I wasn't a liability. I was a witness. And every day, I was getting closer to the truth that would finally set me free. The moment I knew things had shifted for good came on a quiet Saturday morning. Calvin was gone. He'd told me the night before he was meeting a client out in Lafayette, but he didn't say who. He rarely did these days. I watched him leave in his pressed polo and weekend khakis, a duffel bag tossed carelessly into the trunk. He didn't kiss me goodbye. He hadn't in months. Once he was out of sight, I turned off the security system, opened the laptop, and met with Paul and Sandra on a secure video call. We reviewed everything. "The discovery process is officially in motion," Sandra said. "We filed the formal request for all financial documents. He'll be served within a week." Paul leaned into the frame. "You've done the hard part, Grace. Now we hold the line." I nodded. I wanted to believe that, but part of me knew the real fight hadn't even started. That afternoon, I did something I'd been putting off for too long. I called my son. Elliot was 32, married, living in Austin, working in tech. He and I had grown distant over the years, partly because of geography, but mostly because of Calvin. My husband never outright discouraged contact, but he had a way of suggesting it was inconvenient, even indulgent. "You don't need to bother Elliot with our problems," he'd say. "He's busy. You're always too emotional when you talk to him." So I'd pulled back, slowly, quietly, but not anymore. Elliot answered on the second ring. "Mom?" he said, surprise in his voice. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "I was just thinking about you." He paused. "Is Dad okay?" And there it was, the assumption that something must be wrong with Calvin, not me. "We're going through something," I said honestly, "and I thought it was time I told you." I didn't give him every detail. Not yet. But I told him about the trust, the other woman, the child. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to explain it away. When I finished, his voice was tight. I had no idea. "Inflamed and aiding Lyme." "I know," I said. "He made sure you wouldn't." Elliot exhaled sharply. "What can I do?" "Just know the truth," I said. "That's enough for now." We ended the call with a promise to talk again soon. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back. That night, Calvin texted me. "Staying over, early meeting in the morning, don't wait up." I didn't reply. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, curled up on the couch with a throw blanket, and watched an old black and white movie I used to love. It had been years since I'd let myself enjoy something just for me. Halfway through, I remembered something. The safe. It was built into the back of our closet, installed during one of Calvin's many home improvement phases. He claimed it was for valuables, legal papers, sensitive documents. I had asked once what was inside. He'd laughed and said, "Just boring stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." But tonight, I worried. I pulled the closet door open and cleared the shoes and boxes that hid the safe. I'd never opened it before. I didn't have the code. But Calvin was arrogant. I tried his birthday. Nothing. Then our wedding anniversary. Still nothing. I hesitated. Then I typed in the last 6 digits of Amber's phone number, the number I'd found on the pediatrician's emergency contact form. Click! The safe opened. Inside were envelopes, photos, a sealed plastic binder labeled Personal, CRH, and a small velvet box. I reached for the binder first. Inside were insurance documents, beneficiary changes, life insurance policies I'd never seen before. One listed Amber as the primary, another listed Caleb. My name was nowhere on any of them. Next, I opened the velvet box. It held a delicate gold necklace, small, with a charm in the shape of a key. Not mine. I took a photo of everything, every page, every detail. Then I put it all back exactly as I found it and closed the safe. The code, her phone number. Not mine, not his mother's. Hers. The woman he built a second life around while using me as the legal shield for it all. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I walked back into the bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed with the photo of Caleb in my hands, the baby who would one day grow up and learn the truth about his father, and about the woman who refused to disappear. By the time Calvin returned Sunday evening, I had already printed the photographs from the safe, filed them with Sandra, and made an off-site backup of all the evidence. I'd hidden a flash drive in the bottom lining of my handbag, the same one I carried everywhere. He came in carrying a grocery bag and a bouquet of tulips, which made me want to laugh. Tulips were Amber's favorite. He'd given them to me once, years ago, and I'd told him I was allergic. Apparently, he forgot or stopped caring. I thought these would brighten up the kitchen, he said, setting them down with exaggerated cheerfulness. I didn't react. I didn't comment. I simply watched him. I got your favorite wine, he added, pulling out a bottle of Cabernet, and salmon for dinner. I leaned against the counter. You don't usually cook. He smiled, charming, tight. Thought I'd try something new. End quote. You have to spises causa. It wasn't guilt. It was fear. He felt the ground shifting beneath him and was trying to patch the cracks with cheap wine and borrowed affection. But it was too late. I'd seen the truth, touched it, filed it. I'm not hungry, I said. He blinked. Are you all right? I'm fine. You've been quiet lately. I met his gaze. You've never cared about my silence before. That made him pause, just for a second. Then the smile returned, forced and brittle. Let's not make this into something it's not. I almost laughed. That was his phrase whenever he sensed he was losing control. Let's not make this into something it's not. A way to rewrite reality, to gaslight me into doubting what I knew in my bones. But I didn't bite. I simply turned and walked to the living room, leaving him alone with his tulips and his salmon. The next day, Sandra filed the first legal motion, a formal injunction to freeze our joint accounts pending discovery. It was a necessary step and one that would tip Calvin off that the real game had begun. No more shadows, no more hints. This was war. I got the notification while sitting in my car outside the post office. I stared at the email for a long moment before dialing Paul. He's going to explode, I said. He'll see this as betrayal. He already betrayed you, Paul reminded me. You're just making it legal now. That night, I came home to find Calvin pacing in the foyer. His tie was loose, his face red. You froze the accounts, he said, voice sharp. I protected what's mine, I replied evenly. This is insane. Do you have any idea what you've done? I nodded. Yes. I've stopped letting you do it to me. His hands balled into fists at his sides. Grace, be careful. You don't want to ruin everything we've built. We didn't build anything, I said. I built it. You took credit. He stepped toward me. Not threatening, but towering. And I didn't flinch. I know about Amber, I said, quiet and clear. I know about Caleb. I know about the trust, the safe, the fake power of attorney. I know everything, Calvin. The color drained from his face. You've been spying on me? No, I said. I've been watching. There's a difference. One involves lies, the other involves waking up. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he never really had. I walked past him, calm and unshaken, and went upstairs. I locked the door not out of fear, but finality. I sat at the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone. There was a message from Elliot. Call me when you're ready. I've been thinking. I smiled. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone had my back. Later that night, I heard Calvin downstairs, slamming drawers and making phone calls in a low, urgent tone. He was scrambling, trying to regain control. But what he didn't understand was this. You can't manipulate someone who's no longer afraid of losing you. And I had nothing left to lose. 2 days later, Calvin's lawyer contacted Sandra. The email was short, clipped, and full of veiled condescension. It accused me of overreacting, of misinterpreting business arrangements, and my favorite, of being emotionally compromised. Sandra forwarded it to me with a note. He's panicking. That's good. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Every word he sent through his attorney was proof of what Paul had predicted. Calvin never believed I'd have the nerve or the strength to push back. Now that I had, he didn't know what to do with me. That afternoon, I met with Sandra and Paul again in person. Everything he's sending is a bluff, Sandra explained. He's trying to scare you into backing down. He won't stop, I said. He's not wired that way. Paul nodded. But now he's making mistakes. He's emotionally rattled. That's when people like Calvin do sloppy things. He slid a document across the table to me. What's this? I asked. Preliminary audit results. We found a second account in Wyoming offshore holding structure disguised as a tech startup, traced back to the trust. I skimmed the paper, my eyes catching on numbers that made my stomach drop. He moved over $300,000 in the last 8 months, Paul said. All without your knowledge, all using joint funds. Gesture. Can we prove it? We already have, Sandra said, and we're preparing a motion to seek full restitution. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time, I felt something close to justice. Not vengeance, not spite, just clarity, the kind of clarity that comes from finally seeing the full architecture of your own betrayal and realizing you don't have to live under its roof anymore. When I returned home, Calvin was in the garage, pacing again, on another phone call. He didn't see me as I slipped through the side door and into the kitchen. I made a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, waited. When he finally came inside, he looked startled to see me so calm. We need to talk, he said, tossing his keys onto the counter. Do we? He narrowed his eyes. I think we've let things get out of hand. You mean I stopped being quiet? I replied. That's what's gotten out of hand. He sighed. This doesn't have to get ugly, Grace. You're emotional. I understand. But this, it's excessive. I stood, walked to the sink, poured the rest of my tea out slowly. Do you remember the first time you asked me to sign something without reading it? I asked. He blinked. What? Do you remember? I repeated. I know. Why does it matter? Because that was the first time I gave you power you didn't deserve, I said. And every time after that, I taught you that my silence was loyalty. But it wasn't. It was fear. When the dist of the when, he opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. I'm not afraid anymore. He stared at me, and for the first time since this all began, I saw it not anger, not arrogance, fear, real fear. I don't want to go to court, he said quietly. I know. We can settle this, quietly. I'll make sure you're taken care of. I smiled. I am taken care of, by me. Then I walked upstairs, closed the door, and sent Sandra a text. He wants to settle. Let's make sure it's on my terms. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from worry, but from momentum. My mind was already thinking about what came next. A new place, a new name, maybe. A life where I was not someone's shadow, but someone's story. I wasn't sure what freedom would look like, but I knew what it wouldn't. It wouldn't look like Calvin. The settlement proposal arrived by courier 2 days later. A thick envelope, heavy with the weight of half-truths. Calvin didn't sign it himself. His lawyer did. But I recognized the language immediately, phrases he'd used on me for years. Out of respect for the marriage. In the spirit of dignity and privacy. A generous resolution, considering the circumstances. I read it alone at the kitchen table, where I used to grade papers and plan meals. Where I once waited up for a man who was already building a life without me. The proposal offered me a house. Not our home, another one, smaller, in a nearby suburb. A lump sum. A modest monthly allowance. In exchange, I would agree to a no-fault divorce. No public allegations. No discovery process. No mention of Amber or Caleb. In other words, silence. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I took a red pen from the drawer and wrote one word across the top page in bold, looping letters. Rejected. Then I called Sandra. "He's trying to buy my silence," I said. "Like I'm a minor inconvenience." "You're not a nuisance, Grace. You're a threat," she replied. "This is what men like him do when they feel the walls closing in. They make a show of power, but it's all smoke." "I want to go forward," I said. "All the way." She paused, then said with quiet certainty, "Then we go all the way." That night, I didn't tell Calvin I'd received the proposal. I made dinner like usual. Pasta, garlic bread, a salad I knew he wouldn't touch. He came home late, kissed my cheek with habitual detachment, and sat down as if nothing had changed. Halfway through the meal, he finally spoke. "I've done some thinking." I waited. "I know we've hit a rough patch, and I understand you're upset about some things, but dragging this into court, it's not good for either of us." "Not good for your image, you mean?" I said. His jaw tightened. "Grace, I'm trying to protect us. There is no us, Calvin." He dropped his fork. "So that's it? 31 years and you're ready to burn it all down?" I leaned forward, my voice low and firm. "You already burned it down. I'm just refusing to live in the ashes." He stared at me, speechless. I stood, picked up my plate, and walked to the sink. "You want a settlement, Calvin?" "You'll get one," I said, turning to face him. "But it'll be on my terms, because I'm done playing the woman who stays quiet to keep the peace." He stood too, his voice rising. "I built this life." "So did I said. "Only difference is I didn't have a spare one on the side." "AT," he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I sat down at the table again, heart racing, but beneath the adrenaline, I felt something deeper, steady, unshakable. For the first time in decades, I had spoken to him without fear, and he'd heard me, loud and clear. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. It was just a preliminary hearing. Sandra explained nothing final, just the formal start of proceedings. But the moment I saw the calendar notice in my inbox, it felt as though the air shifted around me. This was it. Not the beginning of the end, but the end of my silence. I spent the days leading up to it, preparing not just legally, but emotionally. I reviewed documents with Sandra and Paul. We cross-checked financial statements, gathered records of Calvin's hidden transfers, and organized every piece of correspondence that linked him to Amber and the trust. Sandra had already submitted the request to depose him. He hadn't responded yet. "Let him stew," she said. "That silence is strategy, but it won't save him." Outside the paperwork, I was preparing too in quieter ways. I made lists. Not legal ones this time, but personal ones. Things I wanted back. Things I would leave behind. Things I never wanted to forget. I even started journaling. Nothing fancy. Just a notebook I found in the back of a kitchen drawer. Every morning, I wrote for 20 minutes. Sometimes memories. Sometimes anger. Sometimes nothing more than, "You are not invisible anymore." The morning of the hearing, I wore a navy blue suit with a pearl brooch that had belonged to my mother. Simple, unapologetic, powerful. I tied my scarf around the handle of my handbag, not out of sentimentality, but strength. Sandra picked me up at 9 a.m. She wore sunglasses and carried a leather binder under her arm like a sword. In the back seat was a copy of the filing packet with my name, Grace Holt, typed across the top in bold black ink. When we arrived at the courthouse, Calvin was already there. He stood outside the courtroom, hands in his pockets, talking to his lawyer, a smug man named Travis, who looked like he measured his worth in billable hours and country club invitations. Calvin was dressed immaculately, as always, but there was a twitch in his jaw I hadn't seen before, a nervous blink in his left eye. He looked up as we approached. His eyes landed on me, and for the first time, he didn't smile. Sandra nodded toward him, then leaned in and whispered, "He looks like a man who just realized the story won't end the way he wrote it." Inside the courtroom, everything felt colder. The lighting was harsh. The judge looked like she'd seen one too many stories just like ours. She called the session to order and reviewed the procedural basics. When she asked if both parties understood the scope of discovery, Sandra stood without hesitation. "We do, Your Honor, and we intend to pursue full financial disclosure, including the hidden trust and any offshore accounts." There was a small gasp from Travis. Calvin stayed silent. The judge nodded. Noted. Miss Holt, do you understand your rights and obligations? I stood. My voice was calm. Yes, Your Honor. The hearing lasted under an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. Every word spoken, every paper passed between counsel, every glance, each was another step in a long walk toward justice. When it ended, the judge set a follow-up hearing date and reminded both parties to preserve all financial records. Calvin didn't look at me when we exited. He walked quickly, his lawyer murmuring something in his ear. I stepped out into the morning sun. Sandra exhaled beside me. He's going to push hard now, try to scare you into settling. Threats, charm, even guilt. It's Ebzer. I'm ready, I said. That afternoon, I returned home and found the house just as I'd left it, quiet, clean, untouched. I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen where I'd spent decades feeding a man who fed me lies. The living room where I'd watched him fall asleep during movies he never let me choose. The hallway lined with photos of a life I used to believe in. I stopped in the doorway of the bedroom. Then I turned away. I went to the guest room, the one he'd pushed me into, like I was some temporary burden, and opened the closet. I pulled out the suitcase I'd packed 2 weeks ago, just in case. It was time. Time to stop waiting for him to admit the truth. Time to stop living in the house that held more ghosts than memories. I called Elliot. Come get me, I said. I'm ready. Elliot arrived 4 hours later. He pulled into the driveway just after sunset, the soft rumble of his hybrid SUV cutting through the silence that had settled over the house. I was sitting on the porch with my packed suitcase beside me, a thermos of lukewarm tea in my hands. I hadn't cried. Not yet. Not even when I zipped up the last of my clothes or folded the scarf into the side pocket like a flag I refused to lower. When Elliot stepped out of the car, he paused for a moment. You look calm, he said. I am, I replied. Or maybe I'm just empty. Either way, I'm not staying. He hugged me, longer than he had in years. Then he grabbed my bag without a word and placed it in the trunk. I left the papers on the counter, I said as I locked the front door behind me one last time. Sandra said, We don't have to physically separate yet, but I wanted it clear. I'm not coming back. Not to this house. Not to this version of my life. Elliot nodded. Good. You don't owe him any more of your silence. Actually, Brez, as we drove away, I didn't look back. Not once. We stayed in a quiet Airbnb near his house that night. I insisted on paying for it myself. It wasn't about money, it was about agency. The room was simple. A bed, a desk, a window facing west. But it felt like possibility. Like a place I could begin something instead of just surviving it. The next morning, I called Sandra. I've left, I said. I'm with Elliot now. She didn't hesitate. Then we go on the offensive. End quote. Within hours, she filed a notice of legal separation and a petition for exclusive control of all marital assets pending the final settlement. Calvin would be served the next day. No more passive waiting. No more defending. From here on, we were the ones setting the terms. That afternoon, I received my first official communication from Calvin since the hearing. It wasn't a text. It was an email. Subject: What are you doing? I read it 3 times before replying. Subject: Reclaiming my life. He responded within minutes. You're blowing up everything over a mistake. We can fix this. Come home and we can talk. I stared at the screen. Fix this. Fix what? The hidden child? The trust? The second life he was grooming while I cleaned his shirts and defended his character at dinner parties? I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to Sandra and wrote one line beneath it. Let's prepare for the deposition. That night, I told Elliot everything. Not just about Amber or the trust. I told him about the years of quiet degradation, the subtle ways Calvin had erased me, the lies I told myself to survive, the nights I convinced myself that love looked like sacrifice, that good women endure, that pride is a luxury only men are allowed to have. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, eyes wide, fists clenched. I never knew, he said finally. You weren't supposed to, I replied. That was the point. Answer poured. And then, after a long silence, he asked, What happens next? I looked out the window. Tomorrow, we'd begin preparing the evidence packet for the court. Sandra would issue the subpoena for the bank in Wyoming. Paul would continue tracking the hidden transfers. We'd freeze the assets tied to the CRH trust, and Calvin would finally be forced to answer for what he'd done. But for now, I smiled. I'm going to sleep, in peace. For the first time in a very long time. It has very 5. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. The walls were still lined with oak paneling, the same dull hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. But this time, the weight I carried in with me wasn't fear, it was truth. And truth, it turns out, is a kind of armor. I wore the same navy suit, same pearl brooch, but I added one new item, my mother's scarf, folded neatly around my neck like a quiet promise. Calvin sat at the opposite table. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago, tired. His hair was grayer at the temples, his skin looser around the jaw. He wasn't wearing his usual smug expression. Instead, he looked unfinished. Like the house of cards he'd built was already collapsing and he hadn't figured out how to stop it. Amber wasn't there. Neither was Caleb. But I carried them with me, not out of affection, but resolve. Because this was no longer just about betrayal or heartbreak. It was about justice. Sandra stood to deliver the opening remarks. Calm, methodical, deadly. She presented the facts. The hidden accounts, the forged documents, the misappropriated funds. She showed photos of the trust documents signed in my absence, proof of money funneled into Amber's house, screenshots of text messages, the pediatrician's call log, everything we had built over months of quiet preparation. And then she said something I'll never forget. This is not just a financial case. This is the story of a woman erased. A wife who supported her husband through 31 years of marriage, only to be hidden, replaced, and discarded like a liability. This is not just about assets. It's about dignity. Calvin's lawyer tried to spin it, claimed everything was a misunderstanding, said Calvin had never intended to harm me, that the trust was created for tax purposes, that Amber was a personal matter, not a legal one. But the judge wasn't moved. She listened carefully, reviewed the evidence. Then she looked at me. Mrs. Holt, she said, do you have anything you'd like to say before I issue my decision? I stood. My hands were steady. Yes, Your Honor. I didn't read from a paper. I didn't need to. For years, I made myself small to make my husband look big. I told myself that was love. That was loyalty. But it wasn't. It was survival. I ignored my instincts. I doubted my worth. And I let a man I trusted turn me into a background character in my own life. But I'm done being quiet. And I'm done pretending that silence is strength. Strength is standing here today. The judge nodded. She ruled in my favor. I was awarded 50% of all marital assets, including the CRH trust and its associated properties. Calvin was ordered to pay restitution for the unauthorized transfers. The power of attorney was declared invalid. And Amber? She was never mentioned again. I left the courthouse to the sound of footsteps echoing behind me my own. Outside, the air was warm and bright. Spring had come early. Elliot stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, waiting. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just opened his arms. And I walked into them. Months have passed. I now live in a small cottage just outside Austin, closer to Elliot. To life, to light. I've gone back to teaching, part-time, not because I need the money, but because I missed hearing my own voice in a room full of people listening. Sometimes I still dream about the house I left behind, but I never miss it. Because I didn't leave a home. I left a prison with pretty curtains. People ask me if I ever talked to Calvin. No. He tried, once. A letter, handwritten, saying he was remorseful, that he hoped we could speak as friends. I burned it, not out of anger, but as a ritual, a letting go. Because sometimes, the most powerful justice isn't a courtroom ruling. It's reclaiming the space in your life where someone once tried to erase you, and refusing to ever vanish again. The lesson from this story is clear and deeply resonant. Never let someone else define your worth, especially not in silence. Grace's journey reminds us that loyalty without respect is exploitation, and that enduring abuse for the sake of peace only delays the inevitable cost to your soul. True strength isn't in staying quiet to protect someone else's image. It's in finding your voice, even when it shakes, and choosing yourself. Justice doesn't always come from the courts. It begins the moment you decide you matter.